I want to tell you about the first time I realized that the desert doesn't care about you. Not in a philosophical way. In a practical, mechanical, you could disappear and nobody would find you way. I'd been running rigs for about 14 years at that point, mostly the long hauls between Phoenix and Vegas, and I'd gotten comfortable with the emptiness. Maybe too comfortable. The thing that got me wasn't the noise. It was that the noise stopped. I was on US 93, somewhere south of Wickiup, and the sun had been down for maybe an hour. The road was a straight black line cutting through nothing, and I was doing my usual thing, flicking that old silver coin in my cup holder with my thumb. My grandfather gave it to me, told me it was a trade dollar from the 1870s, and whether that's true or not I couldn't tell you, but the weight of it in my hand is something I've associated with driving for so long now that the truck almost feels wrong without it. I flick it on the long stretches. It's a tick, keeps me grounded. The heat was still coming off the asphalt even though it was well past dark. That's the thing about the Mojave in the summer. The road holds the heat like a grudge. My AC was working but you could still feel it, that scorched sagebrush and baked dust smell that gets into the cab no matter what you do. And the wind. There's always wind out there, whistling through the dry washes and the arroyos, and you stop hearing it after a while. It becomes part of the silence, if that makes any sense. I was maybe 50 miles from anything in either direction when I started hearing the clanging. At first I thought it was a heat shield. Those thin metal plates under the trailer, they rattle sometimes when the bolts come loose, and it sounds exactly like someone taking a wrench to the undercarriage. It's a common thing. I've dealt with it a dozen times. You pull over, you tighten a couple bolts, you get back on the road. 15 minutes, maybe 20. So I pulled over. There's a wide pull-off right there, just gravel and sand and scrub, and I killed the engine and grabbed my flashlight. And here's where I should tell you, I almost didn't get out. Not because of anything I was feeling. I was just tired. I'd been driving since early that morning. I had a gas station sandwich in my gut that was sitting wrong, and the thought of crawling under a trailer in the dark was not appealing. But the noise was getting worse, and you don't ignore a noise like that. You ignore it, you lose a will doing 70, and that's that. The silence hit me first. When I killed the engine, the desert just swallowed everything. No wind, no insects, no distant highway hum. Nothing. It was so quiet it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Like being in a room that's been soundproofed. I've been in deserts before, but this was different. This was the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. I got under the trailer with the flashlight and started checking the heat shields on the driver's side. Everything looked tight. I moved toward the rear axle, and that's when I saw the boots. Heavy steel-toed boots, wedged behind the rear tires on the passenger side. Not standing, not walking, just boots, attached to legs, extending from the deep shadow underneath the trailer. And they weren't moving. I want to tell you I had a clear thought right then. I didn't. My body just stopped. I was flat on my back on the gravel, flashlight in my hand, and every muscle locked up at the same time. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I could feel the gravel pressing into my shoulder blades through my jacket. I told myself it was probably a hitchhiker, someone who'd gotten stranded and crawled under the trailer for shade. People do desperate things in the desert. It gets to 115 out here, and if your car breaks down and nobody comes, you do what you have to do. That's what I told myself. For about 4 seconds. Then I heard the boots shift. I scrambled out from under the trailer on my back, elbows and heels, and I came up on the other side just as a man slid out from behind the trailer. He was covered in white alkali dust, head to toe, like he'd been lying in a dry lake bed. His clothes were stiff with it. His face was gray-white under the flashlight, and his eyes were wide, unfocused, like he was looking at something behind me instead of at me. He didn't say a word. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a piece of metal. Took me a second to understand what I was looking at. It was a shard of glass, a big one, maybe 8 inches long, and the edges had been wrapped in electrical tape so he could hold it. The business end was jagged and bright under my flashlight beam. He slashed at the air between us. Not at me. At the air. Like he was testing the weight of it. I backed toward the cab. I didn't turn around. I kept the flashlight on him and I walked backwards, and he followed me, not fast, just steady, holding that piece of glass at his side. My hand found the step rail and I started climbing, and that's when I looked down at the driver's side rear tires. The lug nuts were off. All of them. They were sitting on the ground in a neat little row, and the wheel was just resting on the hub, barely holding. He jacked the truck, loosened every nut, and set it back down. I would have lost the wheel within minutes of getting back on the highway. At speed on that road in the dark. He wasn't trying to rob me. He was trying to strand me. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, why would someone do that? And I've thought about that a lot, and I still don't have an answer. But in the moment, I didn't have time to think about it because he was coming around the front of the truck, and his pace had changed. He wasn't walking anymore. He was moving with purpose. I threw myself into the cab. The door was still open. I slammed it and hit the lock, and his whole body hit the driver's side door at the same time. I felt it through the steering wheel. The whole cab shook. His fingernails scraped across the paint, and I could hear them, this horrible dry scratching sound, right next to my ear through the window. I turned the key. The engine caught. I dropped it into gear. He was still on the door. I could see his face in the side mirror, pressed against the glass, and those eyes, those unfocused eyes, were looking right at me now. I don't know how to describe what was in them. There wasn't anger. There wasn't even desperation. It was something else. Something flat. I hit the gas and the truck lurched forward and he fell. I saw him go down in the mirror, caught between the truck and the gravel, and then I was on the highway and the mirror was full of dust and I couldn't see anything behind me anymore. The wheel started wobbling inside of 3 miles. I could feel it through the floor, this sick sideways sway, and I slowed down to maybe 30 and limped it all the way into Kingman. There's a service station on the east side of town, and I pulled in there and sat in the cab for a long time before I could make my hands work right to pick up the phone. Highway Patrol came out. They took a report. They drove the stretch of 93 where I'd pulled over and found nothing. No boots. No lug nuts. No sign of anyone. The trooper who took my report was professional about it, but I could see him doing the math in his head, the same math I was doing, which was that there's no reason for a man to be out there, 50 miles from anything, covered in alkali dust, with a handmade weapon, loosening lug nuts on a truck he couldn't have known was coming. They never found him. I had the tires replaced and the rig checked. Every bolt, every fitting. The mechanic said the wheel would have come off at speed, no question. He said it like it was a routine observation. I stood there looking at the wheel sitting on the ground, and I thought about what happens to a truck that loses a wheel at 70 on a dark desert highway, and I thought about the man in the dust, and I thought about the fact that he hadn't tried to take anything from me. Not my wallet. Not my cargo. Not my truck. He'd just taken my ability to leave. I still flinch whenever I hear a rattling sound. I check my lug nuts at every stop now. Every single one. And I've stopped pulling over on the long stretches, even when something sounds wrong. I drive it to the next town and deal with it there. But the thing I keep coming back to is the question I can't answer. Would he have killed me, or was his goal simply to leave me helpless out there in the middle of the desert, with no truck, no phone signal, and nobody coming for hours? Because either way, he knew what the desert does to a person who can't leave. And he was out there waiting for someone to stop. I still have the coin. I still flick it on the long stretches. But now when I do, I'm counting the miles to the next town. Story break. The next one comes from someone who had a very different kind of relationship with the road. People ask me why I left the industry. I always tell them it was the hours, the wear on the body, the pay that didn't keep up with what it used to be. And all of that is true. But it's not the reason. I left because of what I was carrying, and because I knew, even if I never said it out loud, that I was carrying it on purpose. I was 53 when I took the contract. I'd been driving for over 20 years. Long hauls, mostly. I'd done refrigerated freight, flatbed, tankers, the whole range. By that point, I was comfortable alone. I liked the solitude. My husband had passed a few years before. My kids were grown and scattered. And the cab of a truck was the one place where I didn't have to explain myself to anyone. I jingle this brass key ring I keep. It's from a logistics terminal in Phoenix that they tore down back in the 90s, and it's just a habit. When I'm stressed, I jingle the keys. My daughter used to say it was like my version of a worry stone. She's probably right. The firm contacted me through a dispatcher I'd worked with before. He said it was sensitive equipment, high security, the kind of load where you don't ask questions and you get paid well for not asking. I'd done those kinds of runs before. Electronics, defense components, things like that. It wasn't unusual. The pay was nearly double what I was making on standard freight, and the schedule was regular. 2, sometimes 3 runs a week. Always the same route. Yuma to a series of drop-off points in the desert way out in the middle of nowhere. No facilities at the drop sites, just a flat patch of ground and a chain-link fence, and you'd back the trailer in, unhitch, and drive away. Someone else would pick it up later. You never saw who. The freight yard in Yuma was where I'd pick up the trailers. Big place, high security. Automated gates, cameras everywhere, badge entry. And quiet. That's what I noticed first. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel like quiet. It feels like the absence of something that should be there. No chatter. No radio. No drivers leaning against trucks trading stories. Just the constant, sterile beep of sensors and the grinding of the automated cranes overhead. The air tasted like scorched rubber and ozone, and it was dry, that metallic dry that makes your throat feel coated. I was content with the arrangement for a long time. I won't pretend I wasn't. The money was good. The work was simple. I didn't have to deal with people, and after my husband died, that was what I wanted. I drove my routes, I dropped my loads, I collected my pay. It was routine, and routine was what I needed. The first thing that changed was small. I was doing my pre-trip inspection on a trailer, checking the doors and the seals, and I noticed a patch on the side panel. Fresh weld. You could tell it was fresh because the metal was still bright around the bead, not oxidized yet. And the patch was on the inside of the container. The weld marks were on the exterior, but the pattern showed that the metal had been pushed out from within and re-welded from the outside. Like someone had been inside and tried to get out, and someone else had sealed them back in. I told myself it was a repair. A poorly executed one, maybe from a terminal that didn't have great standards. Metal gets damaged in transit, containers get patched. It happens. I signed off on the trailer and drove it to the drop site. The scratching started on my 3rd run. Soft, rhythmic, coming from behind me in the trailer. I could hear it through the sleeper cab wall. This faint ticking sound, like a fingernail dragging across metal. I told myself it was thermal expansion. Metal does that in the desert. The trailer heats up during the day and cools down at night, and the panels shift and tick and groan. I've heard it 1,000 times. I jingled my keys and turned up the radio and didn't think about it. The routes got more frequent after that. For a week, sometimes 5. Always the same drop points, always in the same desolate stretches of desert. I started to notice that the trailers were heavier than they should have been for the manifest weight. The rig sat lower on the springs, the acceleration was sluggish, and I could feel the load shifting in the turns. But I didn't look at the manifest. I'd stopped reading the manifest by then. I'd just check the seal number, sign the paperwork, and drive. I want to be clear about something here. I knew. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I knew that something was wrong with what I was carrying, and I chose not to know the specifics because knowing the specifics would have meant I had to do something about it. And I didn't want to do something about it. I wanted the money. I wanted the routine. I wanted to keep jingling my keys and driving my routes and not dealing with the world. During a routine check at a truck stop outside Dateland, I opened the trailer doors to verify the seal before a drop. The floor of the container had a mark on it. Small, hand-painted, done in what looked like reddish-brown paint. A bird with its wings clipped. The strokes were crude, like someone had drawn it with a finger, not a brush. It wasn't a shipping mark. It wasn't a stencil. It was personal. Someone had drawn it by hand, inside that container, and I was looking at it. I closed the doors. I drove the load to the drop site. I unhitched and drove away. When I got back to the yard, there was a child's shoe on the asphalt near the loading dock. Just one. A small canvas sneaker, maybe a size 4, faded blue. It was sitting by the edge of the dock like it had fallen out of something. Nobody picked it up. Nobody seemed to notice it. I stood there looking at it for a long time, jingling my keys so hard the ring cut into my finger. I went to my supervisor that night. I didn't say much. I just asked about the loads. What was in them? Where they were going. He looked at me with this expression I'll never forget. Not angry. Not threatening. Just tired. like he'd been expecting this conversation and had already decided what he was going to say. He said, "Hattie, some loads are better left entirely unconsidered." And I left it unconsidered. For 3 more weeks. The heartbeat was what broke me. I was on a night run, 2 in the morning, the desert empty and black on both sides, and I heard it through the sleeper wall. Not scratching this time. Tapping. Slow. Rhythmic. The pattern of a human heartbeat. Muffled. Coming from the trailer wall directly behind my head. I turned off the radio. I turned off the engine fan. I sat in the dark and I listened to it, and it was too slow and too steady to be mechanical. It was the sound of something alive in there, tapping against the wall, and it kept time like a heart. I pulled over at a rest area outside Tacna. I sat in the cab for 20 minutes. Then I got out with my pry bar and I walked to the back of the trailer and I broke the seal. The doors swung open and the air that came out was cold. Not desert cold. Stagnant cold. The kind of cold you feel in a basement that hasn't been opened in years. And the smell. Not rot. Not chemicals. Just stale, dead air. Like the inside of a sealed room. The trailer was empty of people. But there were things on the floor, piled against the front wall. Small things. Personal things. A pair of eyeglasses with a bent frame. A gold chain with a cross on it. A small stuffed rabbit, the kind you'd give a child. A hair tie with plastic beads. A man's wallet. Empty. These were not cargo. These were not packing material. These were the things people carry on their bodies, the things that end up in a pile when the people are taken and the things are left behind. I stood there and I understood what I was looking at. I was a coffin driver. I had been driving people, living people, to places in the desert where they were unloaded and never seen again, and the things on the floor of that trailer were what was left of the ones who'd been inside before. I closed the doors. I got back in the cab. I drove the truck back to the Yuma terminal, unhitched the trailer in the yard, and walked into the office. I signed a resignation form. The night manager didn't ask me any questions. He just processed the paperwork and handed me my last check. I moved to a small town in the mountains of New Mexico. I bought a house with cash. I keep the lights on every night, every single one, and I can't look at a shipping container without counting the welds. I count them. Every patch, every seam. I look at them and I wonder which ones were welded from the outside and which ones were pushed from within. I never saw who was in those containers. I heard them. I heard the scratching and the heartbeat and I saw the things they left behind. But I never looked. I chose not to look, and then when I finally did look, there was no one there to see. Just their things piled up in the cold dark. I don't know if that makes me guilty. I think it does. I think choosing not to know is its own kind of knowing, and I think the law would probably agree if anyone ever came asking. But nobody has come asking. The yard is still operating. The runs are still being made. Somebody else is driving those routes now. Somebody else is jingling their keys and turning up the radio and telling themselves it's just thermal expansion. And I'm in my house in the mountains with all the lights on, and I can still hear that heartbeat when it's quiet. Am I still liable for those lives, even if I never actually saw who was in those containers? I don't know. I don't think I'll ever know. But the question doesn't leave, and I don't think it's supposed to. Story break. This third account is from a few years earlier. Same kind of isolation, different kind of wrong. I should start by saying I know how this sounds. I know that by the end of it you're going to think one of two things about me, and I'm not sure either one is wrong. Either something very strange was happening in that cabin, or I was losing my grip on things in a way that I'm not equipped to recognize. I've gone back and forth on which one it is for a long time now, and I still don't have a clean answer. I moved into the cabin in the fall. It had been my grandfather's, and when he died it came to me, along with about 40 acres of scrubland in the foothills of the Superstition Mountains. I was 29 between jobs, and I just walked away from a trucking contract that wasn't working out. Couldn't afford rent in Tucson anymore. The cabin wasn't much, but it was paid for, and it was mine, and at the time that felt like the most important thing in the world. The place was a one-story wood structure, built sometime in the 70s, with a main room, a kitchen, a den, and 2 bedrooms. It sat at the end of a dirt road that wound about 2 miles up from the county route, and the road was in bad shape. Washboard gravel, mostly overgrown. When I pulled up the first time, the porch was sagging and the windows were thick with dust, and the whole place smelled like dry dirt and old pine sap, that sweet, resinous smell that gets into the wood after decades. I spent the first week cleaning. I cleared out the debris, the old magazines, the mouse droppings, the dead wasps in the light fixtures. I scrubbed the floors, I checked the plumbing, I got the water heater working. Felt good. It felt like I was building something, even if that something was just a place to sleep that I didn't have to pay rent on. I wore my grandfather's belt buckle the whole time, this big Western-style brass buckle he gave me when I was 16, and I'd catch myself rubbing my thumb across it when I was trying to figure out how to fix something. He was a calm man, my grandfather. Steady. I think wearing the buckle was my way of trying to borrow some of that. The wind was the first thing that got to me. It howled through the window frames at night, and the cabin wasn't sealed well enough to keep it out. The air was thin up there, crisp, and it carried sound in strange ways. But the windows were what bothered me, and I didn't realize why until I'd been there about a week. Every window in the cabin faced the mountains. The back windows, the side windows, the kitchen window over the sink. All of them looked out at the superstitions, these jagged silhouettes against the sky. Not a single window faced the road behind the cabin. I stood in the kitchen one morning looking out at the mountains and I thought, who builds a cabin where you can't see the road? Who designs a house so that it only looks one way? I let it go. I told myself the builder wanted the view. People do that. They orient houses toward the nice view and ignore the side that doesn't matter. It was an old cabin. People thought differently in the 70s. The first thing I found was in the guest bedroom. I was pulling up the carpet because it was stained and smelled like mildew, and underneath the padding, pressed into the gap between the floorboards, there was a hairbrush. A woman's hairbrush, dark wood, with a few long brown hairs still caught in the bristles. Beside it, a wedding ring, plain gold, worn thin on the inside, and a pair of reading glasses, wire-framed, with one arm bent. I sat back on my heels and looked at them. They weren't dusty. They weren't degraded the way things get when they've been sitting in a floor cavity for decades. The metal on the glasses had a little tarnish, but the ring was clean. The hairbrush looked like it had been used recently. I told myself they were left by previous tenants. The cabin had changed hands a few times before my grandfather bought it. People leave things behind. They stuff them in gaps and corners when they're moving out in a hurry, or they hide things they plan to come back for and never do. It happens. It's not strange. The watch was next. I found it in the kitchen vent, the one above the stove. A man's wristwatch, digital with a cracked face. The battery was dead, but the strap was new, still stiff like it had barely been worn. A week after that, I found a driver's license under the area rug in the den. It was from Arizona, and the photo showed a man in his 40s, clean-shaven, ordinary-looking. The address on the license was a Tucson street I recognized. And then a set of keys in the medicine cabinet, 3 of them on a plain ring, no fob, no label. Each time I told myself the same thing. Previous tenants. Left behind. Forgotten. It was a reasonable explanation, and I held on to it because the alternative was that someone had been putting these things there, and I didn't want to think about what that meant. But the dates didn't work. I looked at the driver's license expiration, the watch's manufacturing date stamped on the back, the style of the keys. All of them pointed to the last 5 years. The cabin had been empty for at least 10. My grandfather had stopped going up there before he died, and the previous owner had been an elderly woman who'd passed in a care facility. Nobody had lived in that cabin for a decade. So how were things from the last 5 years getting into the floorboards? I started writing down where I found each item. I made a little map on a piece of notebook paper, marking the spots in the cabin. The guest bedroom floorboards, the kitchen vent, under the rug, the medicine cabinet, a shoe in the closet, a phone charger behind the water heater. When I laid them all out on the map, they formed a line. Not a random scatter. A line curving gently from the front door through the kitchen, through the den, and ending at the far wall of the den, the one that backed up against the hillside. The wall that sounded hollow when I knocked on it. The hollow sound was wrong. I tapped the walls when I first moved in, just out of habit, checking for termite damage. The exterior walls were solid. This one wasn't. It sounded like there was space behind it, more than just the wall cavity. Something room-sized. I moved the bookshelf. It was a heavy oak thing, my grandfather's, full of old field guides and hardware catalogs. I braced my feet and pushed it sideways, and behind it, there was a door. Not a closet door. A purpose-built door, fitted into the wall, with a simple brass handle and no lock. It wasn't on the blueprints. I'd pulled the county records when I inherited the place, and the original floor plan showed a solid wall there. I didn't open it. I want to be clear about that. I put my hand on the handle and I stood there, and from behind the wood I heard a sound. Muffled. Rhythmic. A ticking, steady and mechanical like a clock, but slower. Too slow for a clock. And it wasn't mechanical, not exactly. There was an irregularity to it, a slight variation in the intervals that made it sound organic. Like something breathing in its sleep. I took my hand off the handle. I went to the kitchen table where I'd left the driver's license I'd found under the rug. I picked it up and I looked at the photo again and I looked at the name. The name on the card was mine. Not a similar name. Not a name that looked like mine. My name. First and last spelled exactly right. The photo on the license was a man I didn't recognize, a stranger, but the name was mine, the address was my old address in Tucson, and the expiration date was 6 months from the day I was standing there. I put the license down. I picked up my grandfather's belt buckle from the table where I'd set it while I was cleaning, and I buckled it on and I packed a bag. I didn't take much. My wallet, my phone, the keys to the truck, a change of clothes. I left everything else. The furniture, the field guides, the cleaning supplies, the notebook with the map. I walked out the front door and I didn't look back at the den. I drove to a motel in Apache Junction and I sat on the bed for a long time. I looked up missing persons reports for Pinal County on my phone. The man in the photo on that license, the stranger with my name, I found him. He'd been reported missing 6 months ago. Last seen in the Superstition Wilderness area. The report said he was a hiker, 42 years old, from Tucson. I contacted a land developer in Phoenix. I told him I had 40 acres with a cabin near the Superstitions and I wanted to sell. He asked how much. I told him whatever he'd give me. He gave me pennies on the dollar and I signed the paperwork without going back to the property. I had a friend retrieve the rest of my things, and I told him not to go inside the cabin. He asked why. I said I'd explain later. I never did. I've never been back. I've driven past the turnoff for that county road a few times on the way to Phoenix, and each time my hands tighten on the wheel and I look straight ahead. I don't know what's in that wall. I don't know if the door opens into a room or a shaft or something else entirely. I don't know who put those things in the floorboards, or how a stranger came to have a driver's license with my name on it, or what the ticking was behind the wood. Here's what I keep coming back to. Was the cabin simply a magnet for those objects, collecting them the way an old house collects dust and memories, or was someone planting them there one by one over the course of years to make me believe I was losing my mind? And if it's the second one, then someone knew I was coming before I did, and they were ready for me and I don't know what they were ready for. I still have the belt buckle. I still rub it when I'm stressed. But I stopped wearing it every day because every time I look at it I think about that cabin, and I think about my grandfather owning it, and I wonder if he knew what was behind that bookshelf too. Story break. This fourth story is the one that sits differently from the rest. It's not about the desert and it's not about the road. It's about a 19-year-old kid working a night shift in a place he shouldn't have been alone. The phone was ringing and the light on the console said room 104. I stared at it. My hand was on the receiver and I stared at the light because room 104 was empty. I checked it out myself at the start of my shift. I'd walked in, checked the bathroom, checked the closet, pulled the door shut, and dropped the key cards back in the drawer. The system showed it as vacant. The light was blinking. Someone was calling from that room. I picked up the receiver. I said, "Front desk, how can I help you?" Breathing. Heavy, wet, deliberate breathing. Not the sound of someone who'd fallen asleep on the phone. The sound of someone who'd called on purpose to breathe at me. I hung up. I know that was stupid. I should have stayed on the line. But I was 19, it was my third night on the job, and I hung up because I didn't know what else to do. I stood behind the desk and I looked at the console and the light for 104 went dark. Let me back up. I'd gotten the job through a temp agency. Night manager at a motel off I-10, near Holbrook. Not a chain place. An independent, maybe 30 rooms, single story on one side, 2 on the other. The kind of place that smells like stale bleach and industrial cleaner the moment you walk in, and the AC is always cranked too high so the air feels artificial, like you're breathing recycled nothing. The ice machine in the hallway clicked every 10 minutes, this mechanical chirp that I could hear from the front desk, and after a few hours it started to feel like a heartbeat. Click, pause, click, pause. I was professionally alone is what the agency called it. What that meant was I was the only person in the building from 10 at night to 6 in the morning. No security, no maintenance, no housekeeping. Just me behind the reinforced front desk with a set of monitors and a phone. I'd applied because I needed the money and I'd worked front desk at a hotel in Flagstaff for a year, so I had experience. They hired me on the spot. No interview, really. Just paperwork and a key card to the back office. I carry a laminated photo of my dog in my wallet. His name's Denver. He's a golden retriever, 4 years old. And I keep the photo because when I'm somewhere I don't want to be, I can look at it and remember there's something waiting for me that doesn't care about any of this. I looked at it a lot that first night. The place gave me a feeling I couldn't name. Everything was identical. Every room had the same bedspread, the same lamp, the same generic print on the wall. But the prints were all hung slightly crooked. Every single one. Not the same direction, not the same angle. Just crooked. Like someone had hung them all in a hurry and never straightened them. I went through and fixed 3 of them on my first night. By the second night, they were crooked again. The man in the tan jacket I'd seen on my first night. He was standing near the vending machines when I pulled into the parking lot, just before my shift started. Tan jacket, dark pants, average build. He wasn't a guest. I checked the register. There were 4 guests that night, all in rooms on the first floor, and none of them matched his description. He was just standing there, facing the vending machine, not buying anything. I walked past him to the entrance and he didn't turn around. I thought maybe he was a trucker who'd parked in the lot and was killing time. It happens. Motels near the interstate get people passing through. I didn't think about him again until the phone rang. After I hung up, I sat behind the desk for maybe 5 minutes. I told myself it was a system glitch. The digital reservation system was old, the kind that runs on software that nobody's updated since the 2000s, and it glitched sometimes. A room shows as occupied when it's not. A phone call routes from a vacant extension. It's wiring, it's software, it's nothing. But the breathing wasn't a glitch. I grabbed the flashlight and I walked to the first floor. The hallway was dark. The motion sensor lights were supposed to come on when you walk through, but they only worked in the main corridor. The wing where 104 was located stayed dark unless you opened a door and the room light spilled out. My flashlight beam cut through the hallway and the air was thick with that chemical smell, heavier down here, like someone had mopped with pure bleach. The carpet was damp under my shoes. The door to 104 was unlocked. I'd locked it myself. I was certain of that. I'd pulled it shut and I'd heard the deadbolt engage. But when I pushed the door, it swung open. The room was empty. The bed was made. The bathroom door was open and the light was off. But the television was on, and the volume was at maximum. Not a channel. Static. White noise. Blasting so loud it hit me in the chest. I flinched. My hand went to the wall and I fumbled for the TV remote on the nightstand. That's when I saw the notebook. It was a composition notebook, black and white marbled cover, sitting open on the nightstand. The pages were filled with handwriting, small and neat, in blue ink. I picked it up and I started reading, and my mouth went dry. The entries were about me, my shift times, when I arrived, when I took my breaks, which door I used to enter the building, what I did during my first night, walk through, checking rooms, fixing the crooked paintings. The entry from the first night described me fixing 3 paintings, and it listed the exact rooms. It described what I was wearing. It described the photo of my dog that I'd taken out of my wallet and set on the desk during my break. The last entry was dated that night. It described me arriving for my shift. It described me parking my car. It described me walking past the vending machines. And it described me not noticing the man in the tan jacket standing 4 feet away from me. The dates in the notebook went back a week. 7 days of entries. Detailed, observational, calm, like a naturalist's field notes. I had started working there 3 days ago. I put the notebook down. I turned off the television. The silence was worse than the static. I stood in that room and I could feel something happening in my chest. This tight, fast rhythm that wasn't my heartbeat, or maybe it was, I couldn't tell anymore. My hand was on my flashlight and I couldn't remember whether I'd turned it off or if it was still on. I looked down. It was on. I turned it off. I turned it back on. I couldn't decide which was safer. The bathroom door was open. I'd looked when I came in. I was sure it was open, but now it was closed. It opened slowly, not dramatically, not fast. Just the way a door opens when someone pushes it from the inside with one hand. Steady, unhurried. The man in the tan jacket stepped out. He was shorter than I'd thought, maybe 5'7", with close-cropped gray hair and clean hands except for his fingers, which were stained dark with ink. Blue ink. The same blue as the notebook. He was holding a pen, a plain ballpoint, and he looked at me with an expression I can only describe as blank. Not threatening, not angry, not scared. Blank. Like a teacher waiting for a student to finish a thought they already know the answer to. I didn't run. I want to say I did something brave, but I didn't run because my legs wouldn't go. I reached behind me and my hand found the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall outside the bathroom, and I pulled it off the bracket and I held it in front of me with both hands. I didn't spray it. I just held it. He looked at the extinguisher. He looked at me. He sighed. An actual sigh, the kind you let out when you're tired of something, when something has gone on longer than you wanted it to. He walked past me. Not quickly. He walked through the doorway, through the hallway, and I stood there holding the fire extinguisher and listening to his footsteps on the carpet until I couldn't hear them anymore. I walked to the door of 104 and I looked out, and I could see him crossing the parking lot. His hands were at his sides. The pen was still in his right hand. He walked into the darkness past the lot lights and I lost him against the tree line. I went back to the front desk. I locked every door I could find. I called the police, and I sat behind the reinforced counter with the fire extinguisher in my lap until the patrol car pulled in. I gave them the notebook. They took the report. They checked the room and found nothing else. They couldn't find the man. They ran the name on the register for the 4 guests and none of them had any connection to the man in the tan jacket. The manager called me the next morning. He told me not to come back for my next shift. He said he'd mail my last check. He didn't ask me what happened. He didn't ask about the notebook. He didn't ask about room 104. He just told me not to come back. I moved into my parents' house that week. I haven't worked a night shift since. Denver sleeps at the foot of my bed now, and some nights I lie awake and I listen to him breathe, and the sound is nothing like the sound on that phone. I keep thinking about the notebook. 7 days of entries. I'd been in that building for 3. Someone had been watching me, or someone had been watching the position, the night manager position, for days before I ever set foot in the place. Someone had been sitting in that room, writing about whoever sat behind that desk, and I was just the latest one. And the man in the tan jacket walked out like I was nothing to him, like I was a page he'd already filled, and he was moving on to the next one. Why did the notebook have entries about me for the last week, even though I had only started working there 3 days ago? I don't know. But the room was ready before I was, and the door was unlocked when I'd locked it, and the notebook was open to the page about that night, and I think it was meant for me to find. I just don't know what I was supposed to understand from it. I still have the photo of Denver in my wallet. The edges are frayed now. I look at it when I can't sleep, and I try not to think about the fact that the notebook described me looking at it too. Story break. The last story in this video is the one I keep coming back to. My sister loved wildflowers. She'd pull over on the shoulder of any highway, no matter where we were going, if she saw a patch of them on the embankment. She'd climb up the slope in her sandals, pick a few, and press them in the pages of whatever book she had in the car. She said the desert ones were the best because they were stubborn, blooming in places where nothing had any business growing. There's a small dried wildflower in my visor, pressed flat between 2 strips of clear tape, from the last road trip we took together before she died. I touch it sometimes when I'm driving. I don't know why. It's just there, and it's hers, and it's the last thing of hers that still rides with me. I was a forestry contractor for the Tonto National Forest. My job was to survey remote sections of the forest, check trail conditions, document illegal dumping sites, and report anything that didn't belong. I'd been doing it for 6 years. After my sister passed, I asked for the most isolated routes, the ones nobody else wanted, the deep forest sections where you could go a full day without seeing another person. The quiet was the only thing that helped. My head was too full, and the forest was the only place big enough to absorb it. The area I was working that day was in the eastern section of the Tonto, up a decommissioned Forest Service road that hadn't been maintained in years. The road was 2 ruts through overgrown scrub, and I was in my work truck, a battered white F-250 with the forestry decal on the door, bouncing along at maybe 10 miles an hour. The air was thick with dust, the dry sage and dead wood smell that saturates everything in the Tonto, and the mountains around me were quiet. Too quiet. That's the only way I can describe it. The Tonto is usually alive with sound. Birds, insects, the rustle of small animals in the brush. That day there was nothing. No birdsong. No wind in the pines. Just the engine and the gravel and the absence of everything else. I'd been driving for about 40 minutes when I saw the truck. It was parked in a clearing off the trail, maybe 100 yards from where the road curved. Not pulled in casually. Backed in, nose facing the trail, the way you park when you want to leave quickly. It was a dark green pickup, older model, with a camper shell over the bed. And I recognized it. A year before, I'd filed a report on a man for illegal dumping. I'd found a ravine in the southern section of the forest filled with construction debris, old drywall, broken concrete, chemical drums. I'd traced it back to a contractor operating out of Globe, and I'd submitted photos and the truck's plate number to the Forest Service. They'd issued a fine. The man had been furious. He'd shown up at the ranger station and yelled at the front desk staff, and they'd called the police and he'd left. I'd never met him face to face, but I'd seen his truck in the photos I took for the report, and I recognized it now, sitting in that clearing a year later, miles from any maintained road. I told myself he was scouting for a new dump site. That's what people like him do. They find a spot, they use it until someone notices, and they find another one. He was probably out here looking for a ravine deep enough that nobody would find it for years. That was the reasonable explanation, and I was a reasonable person, and I had a job to do. I pulled my truck to the side of the trail and I got out. He came out from behind the camper shell. He was a big man, heavy-set, in a dirty work shirt, and he was carrying a length of pipe. Not a tool. Not something you'd use for dumping. A pipe, maybe 2 feet long, heavy, the kind of thing you'd find in a plumbing truck. He held it at his side, and he looked at me, and his face had this expression I'd never seen on a person before. Not anger, not surprise, purpose. Cold, flat, decided purpose. Like he'd been expecting someone, and here I was. He started walking toward me. I was maybe 50 feet from my truck. He was between me and it. The trail was behind him, and I was standing at the edge of the clearing, and the brush was thick on both sides. He wasn't running. He was walking, steady, the pipe swinging slightly at his side. I backed up. I kept my eyes on him, and I backed toward the tree line, and he changed direction to follow me, angling so that he was cutting off my path back to the trail. I could hear my own breathing, fast, shallow, and I could feel the blood in my temples. This thudding pressure that made it hard to think clearly. Then the helicopter came over the ridge. It was a search and rescue bird, the kind the county sends out when someone's reported missing in the forest. It banked over the treetops, rotors thudding, and the downwash hit the clearing like a wall of air. The man stopped. He looked up. He watched the helicopter pass overhead, and then he turned, and he walked back into the brush, and he was gone. I stood there. My hands were shaking. I pressed them against my legs and I breathed, and I told myself it was over. The helicopter had spooked him. He was gone. I could get back in my truck and drive out and file a report and never come back to this section of the forest again. I walked back to my truck. I was halfway there when I saw the tires. All 4 of them. Slashed. Not punctured. Slashed, the sidewalls cut open in long vertical gashes, the kind of damage you do with a knife deliberately when you want to make sure someone can't drive away. The truck was sitting on its rims. I crouched down and I touched one of the cuts and the rubber was still warm and the edges were fresh. He hadn't been walking toward me to confront me. He'd been walking toward me to keep me away from my truck while I figured out what he'd done. The helicopter hadn't saved me. It had interrupted him. The trap was already set. He'd slashed my tires before he ever stepped out from behind that camper shell, and then he'd walked toward me with the pipe, and the only thing that had stopped him was a helicopter that had nothing to do with either of us. I looked at the tree line where he'd disappeared. The brush was still moving. Not from the helicopter. From him. He was still in there. He was waiting. I didn't have a radio. My phone had no signal. I was 8 miles from the main road, my truck was disabled, and I was on foot in a section of forest where nobody was expecting me for another 6 hours. I moved into the brush. Slowly. I found a dense thicket of manzanita and scrub oak about 30 yards from my truck, and I got down on my stomach and I pulled the branches over me, and I lay there in the dirt and the dead leaves and I didn't move. The air was thick with dust and sage and I could feel my heart in my throat, in my wrists, in the backs of my knees. He came back. I heard him before I saw him. Boots on the gravel, slow, measured. He walked to my truck and he stood there and he looked at the 4 flat tires and then he looked around the clearing. He walked the perimeter. He looked at the trail. He looked at the brush on both sides. He was looking for me. He paced for hours. I lay in that thicket and I watched him walk back and forth past my truck, the pipe still in his hand, and I listened to his boots on the gravel, and I kept my face pressed into the dirt and I breathed through my nose and I tried not to make a sound. The sun went down. The temperature dropped. I could feel the cold coming up through the ground into my chest, and my arms were numb, and I didn't move. Sometime after midnight he stopped pacing. I heard his truck start. I heard the engine and then the headlights swept across the clearing, and then the sound faded and he was gone. I didn't move. I lay there until the sky started to lighten in the east, until I could see the color of the dirt in front of my face. Then I waited another hour. Then I crawled out of the thicket and I stood up and my legs almost buckled. I walked. I didn't run. Running makes noise and I couldn't make noise. I walked 3 miles through the brush, cross country, no trail, just compass direction and willpower, until I hit the main Forest Service road. I walked another mile on the asphalt, barefoot because my boots had gotten tangled in the manzanita and I'd left them, and then a county patrol car came around the bend and I stepped into the road and I put my hands up and I collapsed in the gravel. The deputy helped me up. I told him what happened. He called it in. They went to the clearing and found my truck, the 4 slashed tires and tracks from the green pickup, but the truck was gone. They ran the plate. It came back registered to the same man I'd reported a year ago. They went to his property in Globe. The truck was parked in his driveway. The pipe was in the bed. He told them he'd been out there looking for scrap metal. They didn't have enough to hold him. They let him go. I don't go into the woods anymore. Not for work, not for anything. My sister's memorial is up there. A small wooden cross at a spot she loved near the Salt River. And I haven't been to see it in 2 years. I keep the wildflower in my visor, and sometimes I touch it when I'm driving, and I think about her, and I think about the fact that the last place she'd want me to be afraid of is the forest she loved. But here's what I can't stop thinking about. He came out from behind that truck with the pipe in his hand before he could have known who I was. I was in a white forestry truck, same as a dozen other trucks in that forest. He couldn't have recognized me from 100 yards away. He didn't wave me down. He didn't shout. He just started walking toward me with a weapon, and his face had that look, that decided, cold look, like he'd already made up his mind about what was going to happen before I ever turned off that road. Was he trying to hurt me because of the report I filed a year ago, or was I just in the wrong place for something much worse? Because if it was the report, he'd been waiting a year, and he'd picked that clearing and slashed those tires, and he'd been ready to wait me out until I came back to my truck. And if it wasn't the report, then he was out there doing something in that clearing that he was willing to kill to keep quiet, and I drove into it by accident, and the only reason I'm here is a helicopter that was looking for someone else. I don't know which one it was. I don't know if it makes a difference. But I think about that walk, 3 miles cross-country in the dark with no boots, and I think about him pacing by my truck in the moonlight, and I think about the look on his face when he came out of the brush. That look was there before he saw me clearly. It was there from the first step. I still touch the flower in my visor. But some days I touch it and I can't feel anything at all.